Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine delays and irregularities in Peru's presidential election, which are likely to increase political tensions ahead of the June runoff. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we look at Bulgaria's parliamentary elections, which are likely to end the country's prolonged political crisis, and Ukraine's defense against intensified Russian offensives, which is reducing the likelihood of Moscow achieving its objectives in Donbass. We also assess the unilateral extension of the US-Iran ceasefire, the fragile truce in southern Lebanon, rising tensions in Ethiopia's Tigray region, and protest risks in Kenya linked to increasing fuel prices. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover a major earthquake off Japan that has prompted elevated megaquake warnings and the growing likelihood of El Niño in the Philippines and its potential regional impact. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where delays in finalizing Peru's presidential election results are likely to drive further political tensions and protests. On April 19th, Peruvian electoral authorities stated that the results will not be finalized until mid-May, as reviews of vote tallies continue. The first round of the presidential election took place on April 12th and 13th. Early counts indicate that Keiko Fujimori, daughter of former President Alberto Fujimori, is leading with 17% of the vote, 5 points ahead of Roberto Sanchez Palomino. Fujimori, who previously ran for the presidency in 2011, 2016, and 2021, leads Popular Force, a neoliberal conservative party, also characterized as Fujimorism, reflecting the views of her father, Alberto Fujimori. Sanchez leads Together for Peru, a center-left party. Rafael López Aliaga, of the far-right Popular Renewal Party, finished a close third, just 0.09% behind Sanchez. Peru's presidential electoral system follows a two-round format, similar to France. The two candidates who received the most votes in the first round advance to a runoff. The runoff vote is scheduled to take place on June 7th. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The vote, although judged free and fair by external observers, was nonetheless marred by reported irregularities. These included long queues on election day, missing electoral materials, and arbitrary extensions of the voting period at some polling stations. These issues prompted the head of the National Office of Electoral Processes, Piero Corvetto, to step down on April 21st. While early tallies effectively guarantee Fujimori's advance to the second round, the delays in releasing the final results are almost certainly due to the narrow margin between the second and third place candidates. Controversies surrounding the vote have already led to localized protests. On April 19th, around 3,000 supporters of Popular Renewal demonstrated in Lima. López Aliaga, whose chances of advancing to the second round have likely diminished as the vote count has progressed, has called on the National Office of Electoral Processes to investigate the vote. He has previously used more inflammatory rhetoric, issuing an ultimatum to the National Elections Jury to annul the election and calling for a civil insurgency. Further protests are likely in the short term. They are likely to follow the publication of the final results on May 15th. However, other developments, including potential further delays that could shift the release date, also have the potential to drive unrest in Peru. Peru's political system remains highly polarized following the 2025 government crisis, which coincided with large-scale Gen Z protests that left one person dead and more than 100 injured. A Fujimori-Sanchez runoff is likely to be highly competitive. Combined, the two candidates received less than one-third of the total vote, making undecided voters and supporters of other candidates crucial in determining the eventual winner. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Bulgaria's parliamentary elections are likely to end a prolonged period of political instability. On April 19th, Bulgarian nationals voted to elect the 240 members of the National Assembly. Since 2021, the country has experienced a sustained period of political instability, with this latest vote marking the 8th election to be called in that time. The April 19th vote resulted in a clear victory for Progressive Bulgaria, a populist left-conservative party led by former President Rumen Radev. Radev had served as Bulgaria's president since 2017, but resigned in January 2026 to campaign in the parliamentary election. Progressive Bulgaria secured around 44% of the vote, winning an outright parliamentary majority. This makes Radev the country's prime minister-elect and positions him to form the next government. The centre-right GERB-SDS coalition finished second, with approximately 13.2% of the vote. The Liberal PPDB coalition came a close third, with 12.4%. The election campaign was driven by concerns over the cost of living crisis, as well as the perceived corruption of the political class. Several anti-corruption protests have taken place in recent months. These included a wave of demonstrations between November 2025 and January 2026, attended by tens of thousands of people and resulting in more than 100 arrests and dozens of injuries. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Progressive Bulgaria's victory was almost certainly the result of Radev's ability to position himself as a representative of the anti-corruption movement, as well as the impact of the Gelyazkov government crisis, which significantly eroded support for GERB-SDS. In 2024, the coalition had received 26.4% of the vote. Moreover, Radev has historically opposed Bulgaria's entry into the Eurozone, which was formalized on January 1, 2026. He has also taken a more reserved stance on European support for Ukraine, including opposition to sending military aid to Kiev. The decisive election result is highly likely to bring Bulgaria's multi-year political crisis to an end, with the incoming government expected to prove significantly more stable than its predecessors. Moreover, the collapse of Progressive Bulgaria's rivals is highly likely to give Radev a clear mandate to pursue his policy agenda, reducing the short-term risk of civil unrest. However, the structural drivers of protest remain in place. In particular, the cost of living crisis is likely to be the most pressing issue facing the new government. Ongoing energy shocks linked to the Iran conflict are also likely to exacerbate these pressures over the short to medium term. Staying in the region, Ukraine's defense against intensified Russian offensives is limiting Moscow's ability to achieve its objectives in Donbass. On April 22, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha claimed that the country's battlefield position is the strongest it has been in a year. He attributed this to the use of drones, which have helped offset Russia's manpower advantage, and to Ukraine's ability to intercept around 90% of aerial threats over its cities. Open-source data indicates that, in March, Russian forces made close to no territorial gains. If accurate, this would mark the first time this has happened in 2.5 years. On April 21st, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, made disputed and unverified claims that, since early 2026, Russian forces had seized over 1,700 square kilometers, including the last remaining unoccupied sections of Luhansk Oblast. On April 22nd, the Presidency of the European Union announced the preliminary approval of the much-debated €90 billion loan to Ukraine. This had previously been blocked by the Hungarian government. The Presidency also confirmed approval of the 20th sanctions package on Russia. The announcement followed reports that the flow of crude oil from Belarus into EU territory via the Druzhba pipeline had resumed. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Since the Russo-Ukrainian War settled into grinding attritional warfare, primarily in Donbass, Following Ukrainian counteroffensives in 2022, the intensity of Russian ground offensives has broadly corresponded with environmental conditions at the front line. In 2025 and 2026, this pattern has continued. A key Russian offensive against Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast intensified in the latter half of 2025, before the scale of assaults reduced in line with winter conditions. As spring has arrived, Russian forces have almost certainly increased the scale of offensive operations. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, stated that Russian forces launched 619 attacks in just 4 days along the entire line of contact in late March. However, the current intensification of Russian offensives likely reflects a seasonal continuation of existing objectives, rather than a decisive new campaign. Following the seizure of Pokrovsk, Russian forces highly likely seek to encircle the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk agglomeration. This agglomeration includes 2 of several cities that form the so-called Fortress Belt in Donetsk Oblast, a line of heavily fortified, unoccupied towns and cities that has served as Ukraine's most defensible line against Russia. Moscow has almost certainly attempted to acquire these areas via diplomatic means by pressuring Kiev to cede them as part of a ceasefire. However, Kiev is highly unlikely to willingly concede the fortress belt without robust and credible security guarantees against potential further Russian offensives into the less defensible areas beyond it. Therefore, as supported by a publicly stated intelligence assessment from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, the HUR, Moscow has likely set the objective of capturing all of Donbass by the end of September 2026. At current rates of Russian casualties, and with Russian forces almost certainly failing to achieve meaningful breakthroughs despite significantly concentrated forces, this objective does not appear to be achievable at present. The preliminary approval of the €90 billion loan will almost certainly reduce the risk of a 2026 to 2027 Ukrainian fiscal crisis, helping Ukraine sustain its war effort. However, while Ukraine highly likely holds a current advantage in first-person view drone warfare, likely enabling it to prevent Russian breakthroughs despite significant manpower disadvantages, those shortages will almost certainly continue to constrain Ukraine's operational freedom. It is estimated that in March, 96% of Russian casualties resulted from drones. Moreover, the currently high rates of air defense interception against Russian long-range strikes are highly likely to come under significant strain in future. This is due to continued high rates of Russian missile production, alongside a broader global shortage of the Patriot interceptors Ukraine requires to counter ballistic threats. That shortage has been heavily exacerbated by the conflict in the Middle East, with some estimates suggesting that the United States has expended 50% of its Patriot interceptors against Iranian missiles. Turning to the Middle East, the United States has extended its ceasefire with Iran, likely to reinforce its military posture and increase pressure on Tehran. On April 21st, President Trump stated that he would unilaterally extend the temporary 2-week ceasefire agreement reached between the United States and Iran. No exact timeframe was originally provided for the extension, with the administration framing it as indefinite, while negotiations remain ongoing. However, on April 22nd, U.S. officials indicated that the extension is expected to last only 3 to 5 days. On April 21st, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance's trip to Islamabad, Pakistan, was put on hold after Iran refused to send a delegation to the negotiations. Tehran stated that Washington's excessive demands, unrealistic expectations, constant shifts in stance, repeated contradictions, and the ongoing naval blockade of Iranian and Iranian-linked shipping are the reasons it will not return to the negotiating table. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Amir Saeed Iravani, told reporters on April 21st that the ongoing naval blockade constitutes a violation of the ceasefire and called for its removal. Similar statements from Iran's parliament speaker and top negotiator, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, indicate that the continued blockade is no different from bombardment and must be met with a military response. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has responded to the U.S. blockade by harassing, interdicting, and seizing commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. As of April 22nd, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is deployed in the Red Sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group remains in the Arabian Sea. Meanwhile, the USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group has transited past the southern coast of Africa and is now bearing north towards the Middle East through the Indian Ocean. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. President Trump's ceasefire extension is likely intended, in part, to buy time to reinforce the United States military posture in the region. The 3 to 5 day time frame briefed by U.S. officials for Iran to return to negotiations is roughly the same amount of time the Bush Carrier Strike Group is expected to take to arrive in theater, depending on its transit speed. The group will provide the United States with around 80 additional aircraft, 3 additional destroyers, and supporting vessels. In addition to the Bush Carrier Strike Group, approximately 10,000 troops, including Marine Expeditionary Units and elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, supported by amphibious assault ships and other naval assets, are preparing to deploy to the broader area of operations. 3 carrier strike groups operating in the region, combined with expeditionary units capable of seizing terrain or conducting limited ground operations, will almost certainly provide the United States with significantly greater operational flexibility and enhance its deterrence posture. With the Ford Carrier Strike Group operating in the Red Sea, it will likely be dedicated to maritime security and Houthi deterrence in the western sector. This would enable the other carrier strike groups to focus on offensive operations against Iran, as well as defensive operations in the Gulf. The additional destroyers will also provide improved counter-ballistic capabilities. The potential deployment of expeditionary units will also likely signal a credible threat to seize key terrain, such as Iran's economically vital Karg Island or coastal sites. This would form the initial echelon of a wider ground campaign, should the conflict escalate further. These expanded military deployments have likely been primarily aimed at coercing Iran back to the negotiating table and increasing pressure on Tehran to accept U.S. demands. However, this enhanced force posture will also place the United States in a significantly stronger position to conduct strike and counterstrike operations if the conflict escalates further. Should Iran continue to refuse to re-engage in negotiations, it is likely that the ceasefire will not be extended further, increasing the risk of renewed hostilities. If the United States maintains its blockade on Iranian shipping in the event of escalation, Iran will likely broaden its target set and increase attacks on economically vital infrastructure across the region. This would particularly affect assets that enable Gulf states to export oil and gas while bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has repeatedly stated that its forces are ready to resume attacks, and the military has likely used the ceasefire to improve both its offensive and defensive positions. This has likely included the excavation of ballistic missiles and launchers that were buried following the U.S.-Israeli joint strikes, as well as the restoration of damaged systems. Iranian military units have also likely regrouped dispersed remaining assets and repositioned forces to enhance survivability against future strikes. These measures would place Iran in a stronger position to conduct large-scale attacks against regional targets should active fighting start again. Staying in the region, the ceasefire in southern Lebanon has only been partly implemented, with both Israel and Hezbollah continuing to accuse each other of breaches. Israeli and Lebanese officials are scheduled to hold another round of direct talks on April 23rd, as part of a series of diplomatic engagements aimed at ending the conflict in southern Lebanon. Israel and Lebanon announced a 10-day ceasefire on April 16th in an agreement brokered by the United States. Despite the ceasefire, both Israeli and Hezbollah officials have reported alleged violations. On April 21st, the Israel Defense Forces reported that Hezbollah had carried out a series of attacks on its positions in southern Lebanon and northern Israel. If confirmed, this would constitute the group's first attack since the ceasefire was implemented. Also on April 21st, Hezbollah representatives claimed that the IDF had committed more than 200 ceasefire violations since April 16th. However, strikes have remained contained to southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, with none recorded in Beirut since the ceasefire came into effect. The Israel Defense Forces has stated that its units have conducted occasional airstrikes on Hezbollah forces, arguing that these were permitted under the ceasefire framework as they were in response to immediate threats. Moreover, Israeli forces have continued to carry out ground offensive operations in southern Lebanon. On April 21st, elements of the 98th Division were reportedly engaged in intense fighting in Bint Jibil, one of the largest towns in southern Lebanon, located close to the international border. Now our intelligence team's assessment. As of April 23rd, the most significant effect of the ceasefire has been the halt in Israeli strikes on Beirut. Earlier in April, these strikes displaced tens of thousands of people and significantly undermined the central government. While there has been a notable reduction in fighting, both sides have almost certainly used the ceasefire to strengthen their positions in the event of renewed high-intensity conflict. The current ceasefire is set to expire on April 26th, and Israel's willingness to extend it will likely be heavily influenced by the status of the ceasefire and ongoing negotiations between Washington and Tehran. If active hostilities between the United States and Iran resume, it is highly unlikely that Israel will recommit to a meaningful ceasefire in Lebanon, and it will likely use the situation to intensify operations against Hezbollah. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz reiterated on April 21st that the Israel Defense Forces will continue to carry out offensive operations in southern Lebanon until the Lebanese government takes tangible steps to disarm Hezbollah. In response, the government in Beirut has stated that an Israeli withdrawal is a necessary precondition for progress on disarmament. Disagreements over the timeline and implementation of Hezbollah's disarmament will likely remain unresolved in the short term. The Lebanese government almost certainly assesses that moving against the group would be both politically and militarily costly. However, Israeli officials likely assess that sustaining offensive operations in southern Lebanon will maximize pressure on Beirut and gradually force it to adopt a stronger stance against the Shia militia group. In East Africa, the move to reinstate the Tigray parliament is heightening the risk of renewed conflict in the region. On April 19th, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, stated on Facebook that it had decided to reinstate the Tigray Government Assembly, the parliament, which had been suspended in the name of peace. This move would displace the Tigray interim administration as the governing framework and revive the pre-war regional government structure. In its statement, the TPLF accused the Ethiopian government of violating the 2022 Pretoria Agreement, which brought an end to the two-year Tigray conflict. It also alleged that funds had been withheld to pay local civil servants, and that the tenure of the interim administration's president had been extended without consultation. Getachew Reda, the former chief administrator of the Interim Regional Administration of Tigray, and now Minister Advisor for East African Affairs in Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government, responded on X. He described the TPLF's statement as a clear repudiation of the post-war structure. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The TPLF's statement follows a year of increasing tensions after the broadly pro-government Getachew was ousted from the party's leadership by the Debretsion Gebre Michael faction in March 2025. Tensions escalated again in January 2026, when sporadic clashes broke out between the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and the Tigrayan Defense Forces. At its core, the dispute reflects a contest over legitimacy. The Debrecen-aligned TPLF assesses that the federal government is constraining Tigrayan political autonomy through the interim framework. Meanwhile, Addis Ababa views the faction's efforts to restore pre-war TPLF dominance as a challenge to the federally managed post-conflict settlement. The immediate precursor to the statement was highly likely Addis Ababa's perceived attempt to delay regional elections in Tigray. On April 8, Ethiopia extended the mandate of the interim administrator, General Tadesse Werede, the chief administrator of the Tigray region. This move raised doubts about the planned leadership elections on June 1, the date of Ethiopia's general election. It signaled that Tigray's governing arrangement would continue to be set by Addis Ababa through the interim administration, rather than transitioning to a normal regional political order determined through Tigrayan institutions. The TPLF rejected the decision on April 9. This almost certainly served as a precursor to its decision to reinstate the Tigray Government Assembly. The announcement of the restoration of parliament almost certainly threatens a return to conflict in the Tigray region. The 2020 conflict began after the TPLF rejected the government's decision to postpone national elections and proceeded to hold its own regional vote in Tigray, a move the federal government declared illegal. By declaring an end to the interim administration, the TPLF is almost certainly attempting to revive the pre-war government structure. This threatens the legal and political basis of the post-Pretoria agreement transition. If either side attempts to enforce its claim to govern Tigray through military means, a renewal of the conflict is highly likely. Escalating tensions in Tigray also heighten the risk of conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Since 2025, increasing hostilities have led to significant troop buildups along the border. Some reports indicate that Eritrean intelligence helped Debrecen's faction assume power, while Addis Ababa has accused Eritrea of supporting Tigrayan forces. In October 2025, Ethiopia's foreign minister wrote to the UN Secretary-General, alleging that Eritrea was aligning with hardliners within the TPLF against Addis Ababa. A full resumption of the Tigray conflict would likely see Eritrean forces support the TPLF, either through direct military involvement or through indirect funding and logistical support. And in Kenya, rising fuel prices are driving protest activity, with further unrest remaining possible. On April 21, protests took place in Nairobi over rising fuel prices, triggered by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Calls for demonstrations circulated in the preceding week under the social media hashtag #RejectFuelPrices. Despite gaining traction online, the demonstrations themselves were relatively limited. Activists gathered near the Kenya National Archives in central Nairobi, and 10 people were arrested and charged with blocking the free movement of people in the central business district. The calls for demonstrations followed an April 15 decision by Kenya's Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, which sets maximum retail prices to increase fuel costs. Under the revision, petrol prices rose by 16.1%, and diesel by 24.2%. EPRE cited the cost of imported fuel products, which had increased by as much as 68.7%. The new pricing took effect from April 16th and will remain in place until May 14th. Nairobi Police Commander Issa Mohamud stated that the protests were unlawful, citing legislation that requires organizers to notify the police at least 14 days in advance of planned demonstrations and public gatherings. Ahead of the protests, the U.S. Embassy in Kenya issued a demonstration alert. Amnesty Kenya also indicated that demonstrations were anticipated nationwide. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Despite the relatively muted nature of the demonstrations, there remains a realistic possibility of further unrest, driven by the rising cost of living linked to increasing fuel prices. Kenya's fuel imports are heavily tied to Gulf suppliers, and prices have surged following the recent closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Under the government-to-government, or G2G, framework for petroleum imports, established by the Ruto government in March 2023, Kenya is supplied by Saudi Arabia's Aramco Trading, the UAE's Fujairah FZE and ADNOC Global Trading, and Singapore's Enoch Singapore. The decisions of Kenya's United Opposition Coalition will highly likely influence whether further demonstrations take place. On April 15th, former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, speaking on behalf of the United Opposition, issued the government with a 7-day ultimatum to act on a series of demands aimed at reducing fuel prices. These demands include scrapping the controversial G2G fuel import deal, reducing fuel taxes, including VAT and the road maintenance levy, and redirecting funds from major government projects to protect consumers. While the opposition has remained relatively quiet following the muted unrest, President Ruto's only concession so far has been to reduce fuel VAT from 16% to 8%. If fuel prices continue to rise, the United Opposition is likely to increase pressure on President Ruto. Kenya has experienced major protests in recent years linked to the cost of living, and further unrest could escalate quickly. In June and August 2024, a series of mass protests erupted in response to proposed tax increases in the government's Finance Bill 2024. At least 50 people were killed and more than 230 injured as protesters set fire to the Kenyan Parliament building and clashed with security forces. Those forces responded with live ammunition and carried out mass arrests. Widespread protests broke out again in June and early July 2025 after a blogger died in police custody, prompting demands for an end to police brutality. Security forces once again responded with repression, including live ammunition, tear gas, water cannon, and mass arrests. At least 65 people were killed and more than 550 injured. Multiple African countries have also experienced significant increases in fuel prices. Nigeria has recorded the steepest rise, with prices increasing by approximately 65%. Senegal, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa are also notable, either having seen major price increases and fuel shortages in recent weeks, or remaining particularly exposed to oil shocks linked to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Previous waves of unrest in Kenya have inspired similar Gen Z-led movements elsewhere on the continent, including in Nigeria and Mozambique. It is likely that a successful high-visibility wave of fuel protests in Kenya would inspire similar demonstrations in other countries in the region, particularly if it forces the government into major concessions. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake off Japan has triggered tsunami warnings and renewed concerns over a potential megaquake. On April 20th, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake struck off Japan's northwestern coast. The quake prompted tsunami warnings along the country's eastern and northern Pacific coastlines, with authorities cautioning that waves of up to 3 meters were possible in Hokkaido, Aomori, and Iwate. Precautionary evacuations were carried out for around 150,000 people. Ultimately, only small tsunami waves were observed, ranging from 0.2 meters at Urakawa in Hokkaido to 0.8 meters at Kuji Port. The tsunami warnings were quickly downgraded. The earthquake led to temporary suspensions of bullet train services and power outages, affecting around 200 homes. 6 people were injured. In the hours following the earthquake, the Cabinet Office and the Japan Meteorological Agency issued a special advisory warning of an elevated risk of a megaquake. A megaquake typically refers to an earthquake of magnitude 8.0 or above. A magnitude 8.0 earthquake releases almost 3 times more energy than a magnitude 7.7 event. The advisory warned that there is a 1% chance of a megaquake in the next week or so, compared with the normal baseline of 0.1%. Now our intelligence team's assessment. No major damage occurred as a result of the 7.7 earthquake. However, the elevated megaquake risk warning highlights an ongoing threat, low in likelihood, but potentially severe in impact, from a megaquake off Japan. In March 2025, Japan's Cabinet Office released a report with revised estimates of the potential impact of a Nankai Trough megaquake. Seismologists now estimate there is an 80% chance of such an event occurring within the next 30 years. In modeled worst-case scenarios, there could be approximately 300,000 fatalities, more than 1.2 million evacuees, and 2.35 million structures destroyed. Economic losses are estimated at $1.81 trillion, which is almost half of the country's total GDP. These worst-case scenarios involve a magnitude 9.0 or greater earthquake occurring late at night in winter. The Nankai Trough, situated south of Japan, contains the prominent Nankai megathrust fault. However, the warning issued following the 7.7 earthquake related to the Tsushima and Japan trenches, not the Nankai Trough. Official estimates from a 2021 Central Disaster Management Study project that a tsunami resulting from a magnitude 9.0 or greater earthquake along the Tsushima and Japan trenches could, in worst-case scenarios, again during a late winter night, lead to 100,000 deaths from a Tsushima trench megaquake and 199,000 deaths from a Japan trench megaquake. Megathrust earthquakes, such as the 9.1 magnitude Tohoku earthquake in 2011, which led to the Fukushima nuclear disaster, are the most powerful earthquakes on the planet. The areas most at risk from a Nankai Trough megaquake lie along Japan's southern Pacific coast, particularly the prefectures of Miyazaki, Kochi, Tokushima, Wakayama, Mie, Aichi, and Shizuoka. For a Tsushima trench megaquake, the highest risk areas are in eastern and southeastern Hokkaido. For a Japan trench megaquake, the most exposed prefectures are Hokkaido, Aomori, Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima. Japan has world-leading earthquake resilience. Advanced earthquake-resistant technologies, resilient infrastructure, stringent building codes, comprehensive anticipatory evacuations, and thorough disaster response plans all contribute to making the country highly resistant to the impact of most earthquakes. However, particularly powerful events, such as the 2011 earthquake, are still capable of causing widespread damage and high numbers of fatalities. A megaquake, particularly along the Nankai Trough, would be highly likely to place Japan's earthquake resilience under maximum operational strain. And finally, in the Philippines, authorities have issued an alert for a likely El Niño event, which could drive drought conditions and wider regional impacts. On April 22nd, the Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical and Astronomical Services Administration, or PAGASA, issued an alert related to El Niño. Official guidelines state that such an alert is issued based on the PAGASA-ENSO alert and warning system, when conditions are favorable for the development of El Niño, with a forecast probability of 70% or more within the next 2 to 3 months. The alert notes that the probability of El Niño developing in the summer of 2026 is 79%, and that the system could persist into early 2027. The previous alert was issued in late March, and this latest update indicates that the likelihood of El Niño has increased. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. El Niño coincides with the warming of ocean surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific Ocean and is associated with higher sea level pressure in the western Pacific. In the Philippines, El Niño increases the likelihood of dry conditions, potentially leading to localized droughts. This effect is likely to be partly counterbalanced by the southwest monsoon season, known as habagat, which brings increased rainfall to the western parts of the country. In 2023 to 2024, parts of the Philippines experienced catastrophic drought conditions linked to El Niño. These affected hundreds of thousands of residents and prompted 5 provinces to declare a state of calamity. El Niño's impacts are likely to be compounded by other global developments. The ongoing energy crisis caused by the Iran conflict has severely affected East and Southeast Asia. In addition to fuel, the crisis has almost certainly disrupted the supply of fertilizer to these regions, which depend heavily on trade with the Gulf. Fertilizer shortages, combined with lower rainfall, have the potential to drive poor harvests during the 2026 to 2027 season. This, in turn, could lead to food insecurity across the region and increased geopolitical tensions between regional powers as they compete to secure limited supplies of fuel and fertilizer. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.